Well, hello everyone. This is Ganna, Pogrebna, and Patrick Henz, and we are data-driven Formula One. Hi, Patrick.
Hello, Ganna. Hello, all.
And today we are talking about Aston Martin.
Right, quite interesting. We never spoke that much about them in the 1950s, but thought it would be a good opportunity to do so now because 2023. Right now, we are at the beginning of the Formula One season, and it seems that Aston Martin has a quite impressive car. Third position for Alonso in the first race. So we are looking forward what they're doing, what they can do this year. So maybe it's not a good opportunity to see what is the history behind Aston Martin. And that's the idea why we're doing today's episode.
That's right. I just want to again remind people that we are doing this in a form of assisted podcast, I can say. So essentially, we are, essentially we were doing a podcast, but then we thought that it would be great to show you some materials along the way. So we do encourage you to join us on YouTube or Spotify, where you can actually see what we are showing and what we are discussing. And if you are watching us on YouTube, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button so that you could get notified when we are posting the next episodes. Anyway, back to Aston Martin. Yeah.
Back to Aston Martin, and let's say most of us, when we think about Aston Martin, what we really think of is Aston Martin at the movies, especially the various James Bond movies.
Yeah, I was going to say that, even if you don't know what Aston Martin is, surely you know James Bond, and the car that James Bond drives is DB5, and that's Aston Martin, right?
Yeah, I mean, even if he not drives an Aston Martin, this is the car which we would expect him to drive, because he not in all movies he drove an Aston Martin. He drove in the beginning, and luckily now again.
Yeah. That's correct.
As you remember the James Bond movies, a lot of them have quite extended product placement. So, of course, some brands paid that James Bond switches from Aston Martin to their brand.
Right, but I mean, this really, I know that some people will be unhappy, but there is only one James Bond, and that's Sean Connery. And he was driving Aston Martin. So here we go. So obviously, here's Sean Connery, one of his shots, and then here's another one. Which I really like.
Yeah, but even if you don't agree with Ganna, you see also other actors drove the car. As I said, they brought the car back for the latest James Bond movie.
Mm-hmm. And this is Daniel Craig. If you don't see us, we're just showing Daniel Craig as James Bond and Aston Martin. Yeah, and then I just wanted to talk about another thing. Like, even if you don't know Aston Martin, so this is a DB7 model. Mm-hmm. And the next thing that I wanted to show you is a car of a different brand. That's Jaguar. That I used to drive when I lived in the UK. I drove this car, and basically, you probably noticed, if you are watching us again on YouTube or Spotify, probably noticed that these cars are very similar, right? What would be the reason for this? And the reason for this is that Ian Callum, who is the designer of the cars, who was the designer of the cars for Aston Martin and who kind of revamped their design, then got a job in Jaguar. And for many, many years, he was designing Jaguars. So if we go to the next slide, so you'll see Ian. Yeah, that's Ian Callum. And that's the guy who actually designed one of the best cars in the world. When we're talking about, obviously British cars. So Ian himself is from
We're already
Scotland.
limiting it.
Well, he's from Scotland. I mean, I don't want to now get into battles with Ferrari fans, but I'm just saying, Ian is from Scotland, and he does really cool stuff. But I'm just saying, like, if you sometimes noticed how modern Jaguars looking very much like Aston Martins, that's because they really do share a designer. So he went from designing Aston Martins to designing Jaguars. Yeah.
Okay.
So with that prelude, we can go straight into the history of Aston Martin. Yeah.
Right.
And talk about Lionel Martin, right?
Right. Lionel Martin, he established together with Robert Benford Aston Martin as a company, and the first time it was not practically that they built themselves a car, but they used 1908 Isotta Fraschini, quite famous Italian brand at that time, and they used the framework of this Isotta Fraschini and included a 4-cylinder Coventry simplex engine. What you see here on the right is not this particular car, because I think it does not exist anymore, but this is another Isotta which won the 1908 Targa Florio in the south of Italy. Aston Martin, the name, it was because Martin's prior involvement in racing bespoke cars at Aston Hill near Aston Clinton in Great Britain, and Martin comes from his family name. So that's why we have the name Aston Martin.
Yeah, and here's Lionel Martin, and I just love this photo because it's so beginning of 20th century. It's like really cool. Yeah. And you can see what kind of people were driving these cars.
Yeah, but to be honest, at that time, I think only rich people drove cars, so independent of the brand.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me, there is a film with Peter Ustinov, Evil Under the Sun, and there is also quite a few cool films about Poirot, right, with various actors, and you can see kind of the same style here in this photo.
Right.
Yeah,
quite dandy style. So, as you already can imagine, seeing the photo, he was born by a quite rich family. His father, Edward Martin, mother, Elizabeth Emily Birch. He studied at Eton College, member of the Oxford University Bicycle Club, his other big passion, and also later in the Bath Road Club. By the way, if you have the opportunity to visit the UK, Bath, a very beautiful little town with Roman baths. That's why the name.
Yeah, and then he met in at the beginning of 20th century in 1909. He met Robert Benford, and that's how they started Benford and Martin Limited company.
Yeah, the thing is, he was active in racing, and seems that for whatever reason he got a fine which he declined to pay. I don't know if he don't want to pay, didn't have the money to pay, whatever. So he was banned for driving for 2 years. But at that time, they started thinking about building cars. That's why was the motivator for him. And in November 1925, the two founded Benford and Martin Limited did it before, and already in 25 they went into receivership, and Martin was no longer the director of the company. And this meant quite interesting side information for you. even if they founded Aston Martin, he never owned an Aston Martin himself.
Mm-hmm.
Due to the petrol rationing in the Second World War, he returned to traveling on his bicycle, as I said, his other passion. And unfortunately, October 14, 1945, he was knocked off at a set of traffic lights on Gloucester Road near his home, and then died at age 67 in Kingston Country Hospital. Later, let me see, 7 days later, the same year.
Yeah, that's correct. And again, irony, you make cars and you kind of get into a road accident like that on a bike.
Yeah. Aston Martin was a company which had been various owners over the time, but let's say for this episode, we will focus a little bit more on the motorsports, especially Formula One, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So the first Formula One car was the DBR4, which you will see on the next slide, at least if you see us on YouTube and on Spotify. But it was not their first race car. The car was developed in 1957, but only appeared in Formula One 2 years later. The reason for this is the company wanted to focus first on the DBR1 sports car, which had been quite successful in endurance racing, especially in Le Mans, where they won the 24 hours in 1959. So even if 59 was not a good year for Formula One, for Aston Martin, it was quite successful as they won the Le Mans race.
Mm-hmm. And they were not very good at in Formula One, and
the big problem was practically it was never a really competitive car, which maybe also be understandable. We're speaking about a small team with no big budget. Nevertheless, a beautiful car. You see the same green as they still use today. So it's not that typical dark British racing green, but a lighter mint green metallic. I would describe it the same as you practically see in today's Formula One car. 1959. The best result had been in the Netherlands, Zandvoort and Monsanto by the number 1 driver, Roy Salvadori. Second only in some races. Famous name, Carroll Shelby, 0 points. The same Carroll Shelby who developed the Shelby Cobra. So if you're watching another movie, Ford versus Ferrari, this is practically about Carroll Shelby. I think the name is a little bit misleading because the movie not focuses that much on the duel between the two brands, but pretty much on Carroll Shelby, and could also be called Shelby versus Ford if you see the movie. Similar as today, already in the 1950s, sponsors could buy, becoming a name of the racing team. And in this case, the team was called David Brown Corporation Aston Martin. But attention, David Brown at that time was the owner of Aston Martin. So it's not just that they've been sponsoring, but indeed, they had been the owner of the Aston Martin company.
Mm-hmm. And David Brown was basically the owner at one point, right?
At that time, yes.
Yeah.
They acquired Aston Martin for 20,000 British pounds.
Yep. It would be cool to do that now.
Yeah.
I think Aston
And
Martin,
also-
the cheapest one is 140K, right? The expensive, the DB5 is probably 3.5 million, like average price for it. So yeah, I mean, we have a span between 140K and the 3.5 million and more, I imagine, for some of the historical models.
Yeah, so this was the price in 1947, and also Brown acquired another company, Lagonda, for 52,500 pounds. Later, these two brands somehow merged, as we had, for example, the not that famous Aston Martin Lagonda sedan, which was not very reliable, and I mean, it was quite famous for not being reliable, and due to this not had been on the market for that long, if I remember it right. So here we see some photos of the car from the inside. And this should be, by the way, sorry, say 1960. This was the second and last year for Aston Martin in Formula One. Now really being this time they focused only on one driver, Roy Salvadori, who had two races, so they not really drove the whole season.
Mm-hmm.
And Maurice Trintignant one race, and after this they pulled the trigger because the car was not competitive. Again, we're speaking here about Formula One. In opposite to this, Le Mans 1959 was very successful for the Aston Martin DB1. As you see, a similar model here in the photo. First position for the combination Carroll Shelby, Roy Salvadori, so the two Formula One drivers from 1959. And second position, Maurice Trintignant and Paul Frère. Maurice Trintignant, who should become a Formula One driver for Aston Martin in 1960.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and I think we didn't explain why it's called Aston Martin, right, Patrick?
We did.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, we did.
Oh, okay, we did.
It's because the
Lennon Martin, because he took the Aston Clinton Hill race, right, and won.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is practically the history of Aston Martin in Formula One. So as Aston Martin came back some time ago, you may think it's a company with a long, rich Formula One history. But to be honest, this was not the case for Aston Martin.
Right, but again, I think they made the choice to just concentrate on the luxury car market rather than to go into racing. And I think from the history of Ferrari that we have been sort of looking at for the last for the last few years with you, it was essentially, it was sometimes a struggle to keep up with both markets. So it's not easy.
Yeah.
And
no, indeed, it's not easy, and that's why I think most probably it was a good decision not to spend that much money on Formula One at the end of the 50s, especially as Aston Martin was traditionally a company, a brand which has been struggling, changed ownership various times, so I think it was an understandable decision. For this, we have a very long fast forward, and we are now in the year 2008. David Richards, now the head of the consortium that owns Aston Martin and also has a tech firm called ProDrive. They had been in contact with Formula One, and they even received a spot to enter as a new team in 2008. Nevertheless, at that year, Richards decided Aston Martin wasn't there yet to enter with a whole team, and so they waited a little bit more. next year, 2009, they still expressed the interest in coming to Formula One in 2010, but mostly not with a team, but maybe with a sponsorship. But this not happened, so it takes another 6 years until we see finally the name Aston Martin in Formula One, not as a team, not as a manufacturer for engines or any other kind, but as a sponsor, as you see them here on the Red Bull car. So they have been sponsoring Red Bull from 2016 to 2020, where from 2018 on, they had been the main sponsor and even giving the rights for the name. So it was Aston Martin Red Bull Racing at that time.
That's correct. So they kind of supported Red Bull quite a lot.
Exactly.
Yeah, and just in case you're wondering who owns the company, Lawrence Stroll, who is a billionaire from Canada, basically has the major share in the company, right?
Right, 16.7 Lawrence, and of course now you can make the connection. Lawrence Stroll had been the owner of the Racing Point after their Indian owner had to leave due to problems with the law. So Lawrence Stroll was the owner of Racing Point, and with acquiring the rights into Aston Martin, of course, it made much sense to use this connection and rebrand Racing Point to Aston Martin. And honestly, I hope I don't say anything wrong here, but I think Racing Point wasn't also the former Jaguar team, or I'm here on the wrong track.
I'm not sure. I know that. Yeah.
I know it was of course, it was Force India, but before Force India,
yeah.
I'm not sure if it was the Jaguar team, which.
Yeah.
So.
Anyway,
when
we get to this, we'll get to this. So, by the way, tell us if you know the answer to this question. But also, yeah, we have a substantial Mercedes stake in the business, right? Almost 10%.
Exactly,
Mercedes.
and I mean this explains why Aston Martin, of course, is using the Mercedes engine, as also Racing Point was doing before. So there's no change, but I'm sure as long as they are called Aston Martin, as they're involved, I think they cannot switch the engine. So I think from all the customer teams, Aston Martin today has the best relations to Mercedes Benz, in opposite maybe to McLaren and to Williams, who are more customers. So they pay for the engine, but it would be quite possible for them to switch to another one, like let's say Renault, Honda, or Ferrari, if they think it would work better. But let's say Aston Martin have a closer connection to Mercedes-Benz. Okay, so then we are coming to the new era of Aston Martin, which not started that successful. 2021, the Aston Martin cognizant F1 team with the Mercedes engine, the RMR 21, as you see it on the right, 77 points, 7th position in the Constructors' Championship. Drivers, former 4-time champion Sebastian Vettel on 12th position with 43 points, and Lance Stroll, 34 points, 13th position. As you know, Lance Stroll, the son of the owner. Yep. And another fun fact, Sebastian Vettel traditionally names his car, and this one he baptized Honey Rider, which is the name of the character from the James Bond movie #1, the first James Bond movie, which was played by the Swiss actress Ursula Andress in that time.
Mm-hmm. Right. And in 2022, he decided not to name the car because it wasn't performing greatly. So it does depend actually on the performance. So you get a name only if you perform decently, I guess.
Right. But this is how he explained it in an interview. Even if 2022 already better results, 37 points and the 7th position for Sebastian Vettel, and this even if he lost 1 or 2 races due to COVID, where he was replaced by Nico Hülkenberg, who is now active again for the Haas Formula 1 team. Lance Stroll, 18 points and the 15th position. The official name of the team that year was Aston Aramco Cognizant F1 team. Cognizant is an American multinational information technology service and consulting company. And Aramco is, of course, Saudi Aramco, the official Arabian oil company.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, Cognizant is very well known, especially to those who does work with NASDAQ. Yeah. So,
yes.
Yeah. So multiple sponsorships, very diverse.
Right.
And this year they've got Fernando Alonso, right?
Yeah, as Sebastian Vettel decided to retire and to make place for somebody younger, they hired Fernando Alonso.
Yes, that's right. That's
Fernando Alonso,
up and coming guy, yeah.
Yes, some young talent. I mean, I'm pretty sure we will do a special episode one day about Fernando Alonso. I mean, very interesting character, not an easy person. And in opposite, for the ones who saw our episode with Niki Lauda, he left a lot of teams with burnt ground. So a lot of teams where he maybe wasn't or isn't welcome anymore. But nevertheless,
yeah, McLaren, I think, would agree with that, especially when we get to 2007, when there was a scandal between Ferrari and McLaren about stealing information. Right. Fernando Alonso was not very well liked in McLaren because of the evidence that he gave in that case. Yeah.
But nevertheless, a great talent. A little bit surprising that he decided to leave Renault Alpine. But let's say, as far as we can see after the first race, we've seen where is Aston Martin and where is Alpine. I think quite a smart move if you had the opportunity to do so.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure that it was with Patrick. We just the previous episode that we discussed with Niki Lauda and how he was paid $3 million to come back from the retirement. I'm sure that there was an argument from the Aston Martin team that Fernando Alonso could not reject, and that's why.
I'm pretty sure it's more than $3 million.
Yes.
Okay, but nevertheless, very impressive in the trainings before the season and also in the first race. So we are looking forward to what this team and Alonso can do this year.
Right.
And, we will end this episode as we began it, speaking about James Bond. So you see here the most famous Bond, Aston Martin, I think for most of us, is the mentioned DB5, as you see it on the photo. But also there have been used other cars, the DBS in the 1968 movie On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the famous Bond movie with the actor who only played it once. Then for nearly 2 decades, no more Aston Martins, which I think was pretty much because other brands paid more. But it returned 85 with the Aston Martin V8 Vantage, the Living Daylights. Then 2008, again, nearly 20 years later, with the Aston Martin V12 Vanquish. The DBS V12 in Casino Royale, and then in the DB10 in Spectre. 2018, the DBS Superleggera. And in the last one, there have been the two, if I'm correct, yes, there have been the two Aston Martins. James Bond drove still the DB5, and I think the car was destroyed, if I remember it right, but I'm sure it was a replica, so don't worry. And we also saw the Aston Martin Valhalla, but interesting side note here, you see the car in Q's laboratory, but it was not driven by Bond.
Yeah, that's right.
And also, as you have this obvious relation, Aston Martin and James Bond, for the latest movie last year. I'm just looking, it was last year. So the Valhalla must be 2022 and not 23. So anyway, the James Bond movie had been a sponsor for the Monza race, I think, on the Aston Martin Formula One car.
Right. And well, like I said, even if you don't know anything about Formula One or anything about Aston Martin, you definitely know something about James Bond, and you probably have seen an Aston Martin in that movie.
Yeah. If not, you saw a lot of photos today.
Yeah, just as as always, we recommend you something to read. And there is a great book by Andrew Noakes where you could see pretty much all models and really cool pictures of Aston Martin through the years. And another book that I can recommend is a book by Ulrich Betz, Aston Martin, Making Aston Martin, it's called. If you're wondering who Ulrich Betz is, he was a CEO of Aston Martin. And I believe he retired in 2013, but before then he was very much inside the whole process of making Aston Martin. So please check this out. It's a really good book.
Yeah. So this is our recommendation for the day of today.
That's right. And with that, that completes our episode on Aston Martin. Thank you so much for your attention, for being with us. And again, I just want to remind you that we are on YouTube and Spotify in video format, and we are on a lot of different platforms. Thanks to Patrick in podcast format. And we're hoping to see you next time.
Yep, indeed.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks to all. Have a nice day or evening whenever you are watching or listening to us.